Well, it is a tremendous privilege to be back here. I really love coming and visiting New Zealand. I've been doing it for about 5 years now. Actually, with some really good friends of mine from a ministry here called Thinking Matters that run a series of conferences every year. They're actually going to have one here in Auckland just in 3 weeks' time with one of the best speakers that I'm aware of to help you wrestle with big questions, Dr. Sean McDowell. So you can actually see up the back there, you'll find flyers for the conference here in Auckland in a few weeks' time. It's worth getting along to a Friday night free event that's open for everyone, or Saturday paid event that's ticketed. Please do check out that. It'd be really, really worthwhile your time. And in fact, our good friend Gerald has come from Thinking Matters team to be able to answer any other questions you can have. Please do chat with him. But today I'm honored to be able to dive into a number of different big questions that people are often confronted with when it comes to Christianity. And this morning may not exactly be what you're used to in a morning service of opening up the scriptures and getting to preach something about Jesus or some wonderful story from the scriptures, but we're going to tackle a question that is the number one reason why secular people say they're not interested in God. And it's to do with science. You've had McCrindle research done here in New Zealand. We've done similar McCrindle research over in Australia. It's a sociology research firm. They do big polls to find out where are people out towards attitudes when it comes to belief in God or to Jesus. And in Australia, of the growing number of people that tick in the census no religious affiliation, the people that they're calling the religious nuns, and that's not a Sister Act Whoopi Goldberg remake. These are the people that want nothing to do with religion and the church. The number one reason that they gave, 49% of them, as to why they're not interested in the God question is because they prefer a science or evidence-based approach to forming their beliefs. In other words, there is a huge number of secular people that are convinced that you have to choose between faith and fact, between revelation and reason, or between God and science. That these are competing explanations for how the world works. In fact, one of the more popular science communicators, Neil deGrasse Tyson, put it this way. He said that God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. Now, you'll see him, if you're a young person, popping up on Reels and Instagrams and Shorts and all these sorts of things, making these statements on Joe Rogan's podcast or others. In his mind, that God is the thing that religious people for thousands of years have plugged into all the gaps in our knowledge of the natural world. And you can understand where he's coming from. If we were to jump in a TARDIS or a time machine, and we went back 2,000 years in time, and we began to chat to our Roman and Greek ancestors, and all of a sudden, as I hear happens fairly often here in New Zealand, a storm kicks up. And thunder and lightning from above. And you would see a lightning bolt and you'd say, what's that? Well, they would tell you that is Zeus from up on Mount Olympus. Someone has ticked him off, and so he's sending them a little bit of a zap from on high. And then you would hear the clap of thunder. People would say, what is that? And well, one of our Nordic friends would say, that is obviously Thor, the god of thunder, striking his hammer. Chris Hemsworth in argument, war with these great alien overlords. And they would use the gods, supernatural beings, to explain all manner of natural phenomenon that they didn't know how to explain. And the role of science has been to fill in those gaps in our knowledge. Now we know that lightning is really a static discharge from the upper stratosphere, that all of the energy that gets built up by the water molecules has to be grounded or earthed, and so eventually, boom, lightning. And we know that the thunder comes from the expansion of heat from the obviously very, very large amounts of energy that are part of the lightning bolt. As that heats the air around it, it creates that boom, that noise that we hear. That's thunder. Well, if your belief is that God is just the thing that you use to explain any gaps in our knowledge, and as science continues to fill in all those gaps in our knowledge of the natural world, well, you end up with this idea that God is an ever-receding pocket of scientific ignorance. And so many people today reject belief in God simply because they think there is no good reason to believe in God, that science has acted as God's pallbearer, undertaker, ultimately burying God as any kind of explanation. Now, I don't believe that. And I don't think that is at all in line with the Christian story or the scriptures. And what I want to share with you today are just a few reasons why, far from burying God, I think it is the work of science to resurrect a rational belief in God in our modern time. As Werner Heisenberg, a former winner of the Nobel Prize, said, "The first sip from the glass of the natural sciences will lead you to become an atheist. But at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you." I want us to drink deep of the glass of the natural sciences today to see how actually our natural world points towards the existence of God. And let me start first with a problem for people like Neil deGrasse Tyson when it comes to the existence of Christian scientists. Because if science had buried God, then there is a very obvious set of casualties that you would expect to find strewn out upon the intellectual battlefields. Namely, scientists who believe in God. Because for any scientist who was worth their salt, if what they study disproves God, then we should find, in fact, that the best scientists are all atheists. And yet that is simply not the case. Let me give you some examples. On the left here, you'll see a man with some of the most impressive eyebrows. He's made it into the next Lord of the Rings movie, I promise. That's Francis Crick, a wonderful scientist, the first director of the Human Genome Project, but an atheist, outspokenly so. The man standing next to him with a smile and glasses is Francis Collins, the second director of the Human Genome Project, another award-winning scientist, but himself an evangelical Christian. Writes a book called The Language of God, describing how his study of DNA leads him to a profound belief in a God who is the author of the information found in every living cell. Both of them are elite scientists. One doesn't believe, and yet one does. The next man is someone who may be familiar to you, the late, great Stephen Hawking, an incredible mind, a theoretical astrophysicist taught at Cambridge, himself an atheist. Didn't believe in God, didn't think that God is necessary as any kind of explanation for anything. And yet the man standing next to him, Sir John Polkinghorne, was one of his colleagues. Also teaches at Queen's College at Cambridge, a theoretical astrophysicist, a brilliant mind, and yet an evangelical Christian. His first doctorate actually was in theology before he went on to teach in science. Both incredible minds, all of them elite scientists, and yet some believe and some don't. Which means it must be more complex than simply that nature points away from the existence of God. In fact, this problem gets even bigger when you take a bird's eye view of the 20th century. I'll see if I can get this to click. Maybe if you guys could chuck the next slide up, that would be great. This is a map of all of the Nobel Prizes won in the hard sciences throughout the 20th century, from 1901 to the year 2000. What you'll notice is that 65% of those Nobel Prizes were won by Christians. An additional 20% were won by people who aren't just secular Jews, meaning Jewish by ethnicity, but are religious Jews, Jewish by conviction, meaning over 85% of all of the Nobel Prizes won in the sciences in the 20th century were by people who believed in a personal God. Now, is this just happenstance? I mean, the vast majority of Western countries had a higher percentage of Christians in the 20th century. Maybe this is just a factor, but when you trace it back, there is a powerful connection here. If you go back to the origins of the scientific revolution in Christianized Europe, what you'll find is that all of the fathers of the modern fields of science, all of the progenitors in their areas, are themselves believers in God, believers in the Bible, believers in Jesus. From Galileo Galilei to Johann Kepler to Isaac Newton to Michael Faraday, all of them had a profound belief in God, and far from hindering their scientific work, which is what you'll often hear, that religion hinders science, it was their faith that drove them to do science in the first place. Isaac Newton, in his work, the Principia Mathematica, one of the most revolutionary treatises in science, the opening, his preface, spells out how he hopes his discovery of the laws of nature will lead his skeptical colleagues to believe in a divine lawgiver, that there is a reason our universe is ordered. In fact, historians of science have sought to study why is it that it wasn't the barbarians in Germania, that it wasn't the philosophers in Greece, that it wasn't the animists in Africa or the mystics in the Orient? Why was it the Christians in Europe that led to the catalyzation of the modern scientific revolution, the inductive principle? What explains this unique phenomenon, this emergence? And they've arrived on one very simple reality, that there was something in the soil of Christian belief that leads naturally towards a scientific endeavor. And let me spell out what they mean by this. If we go back to Rome or to ancient Greece, if natural phenomena are controlled by capricious gods, remember they went to Mars if they were going to be going off to war, to offer sacrifices, to please him to get a favorable outcome. They would go to Aphrodite if they wanted to have children, the goddess of fertility, in order to be able to bless them to have a good family. They would go to different gods for different reasons to be able to offer sacrifices so that they would gerrymander the forces of nature in their favor. In other words, in the ancient world, there is no sense of the regularity of nature. The forces are constantly in flux, changing with the whims of individual gods. Only if you believe that there is order at the center of reality, that there is a divine lawgiver who upholds the universe by the power of his word, do you arrive at the necessary preconditions to think that science is possible in the first place, that nature is going to operate with law-like function that is observable and repeatable. And there is now a vast literature in the history and philosophy of science that explores exactly the base beliefs in Christianity that make this possible. Genesis 1 teaches that behind our universe lies an eternal mind. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. A rational, ordered mind. It teaches that this God goes about taking the chaotic elements of creation. The Spirit hovered over the waters. And he goes about adding layers of order to creation, separating light from darkness, day and night, separating the skies above, space from our atmosphere below, separating the land from the water, and then populating these spaces, creating order, ultimately to bring about human beings. And it's not just that our universe has this order, that it is itself intelligible. It's also that human beings were created in the image of God, with minds that are capable of unlocking the secrets that God has woven into the universe. We have a rational mind patterned after God's mind. And not only do we have the capacity to study creation, in Genesis 1 we have the command to do so. The very first commandment given to humanity: be fruitful, multiply, subdue the earth, and rule over it. God had cultivated a small garden in the east in Eden and given humanity the responsibility to expand its borders by cultivating the rest of the wild world beyond Eden. But if you're going to subdue nature, if you're going to irrigate farmlands, if you're going to construct vast cathedrals and buildings and cities, then you need to understand material science and weather patterns and meteorology and everything that's necessary in order to ultimately use it towards human enterprise. And so these first scientists, when you read their writings, Johann Kepler in his Mechanics describes himself as thinking God's thoughts after him. And as he often does, C.S. Lewis, in a single sentence, sums up what takes these historians and philosophers of science giant tomes to write. And he said this: men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That the Christian story provides all of the necessary soil and fertilizer out of which science could ultimately blossom. But you might be thinking, all right, enough with the history, Dan, enough with the philosophy. Yeah, I get maybe there's some early way in which these two things come together, but surely the discoveries of science have made it impossible to believe in God or to think that the Christian story has anything serious to offer. Well, let's look at some of these discoveries. Science, by definition, if you open Webster's or Merriam's or Oxford dictionaries, you'll say something like this: that science is the systematic study of nature through observation and experiment. The systematic study of nature through observation and experiment. And far from disproving God, Ard Louis, a theoretical physicist at Oxford, says the more we have studied the universe, the more it points towards God rather than away from him. And I want to share with you a couple of discoveries just in the last 100 years alone that strongly align with the central claims of the Christian story, that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the first has to do with the origins of our universe. If you and me, again, jumped in a time machine, I'm a big fan of time travel if you haven't told already, and we were to go back 100 years in time and to walk into the office of Bertrand Russell, a famed British intellectual, but an atheist. He wrote a tract called Why I'm Not a Christian. He was the Richard Dawkins of a previous generation. And we were to say to him, when did the universe come into existence? Bertrand Russell would say to you, no, that's wrong thinking. The universe has always existed. It's eternal, it's a brute fact, that is just the way that it is. And this was the favored understanding of our natural world by secular thinkers. They wanted the universe to be eternal because to say that the universe has a beginning requires that there be some cause, something outside of the natural world to bring it into existence. That sounds an awful lot like God. But an eternal universe doesn't require a God. And so that's our thinking. It's always been here. But all of a sudden in 1915, 1917, Einstein came up with his famed theories of general and then special relativity, developing calculations that allow us to make predictions about our space-time, to be able to predict that it is expanding in its current iteration. A few years later in 1922, Georges Lemaitre, he was a Catholic monk but a physicist, he worked with Einstein's equations to predict exactly how long ago if we would have seen the origin point of the universe. That if it is expanding, that means it must contract at some point in the past, all the way down where all energy and matter was a single point, something smaller than a pinprick, smaller than the size of an atom. This expansion was then observed by Edwin Hubble. Some of you might be familiar with the Hubble Space Telescope, one of NASA's chief engineering prowess that they have over there. In fact, it's a Christian, Jennifer Wiseman, who heads up that project. It's now been replaced by the James Webb Telescope. It's a wonderful piece of technology, giving us beautiful pictures of deep space. But Edwin Hubble developed a new telescope, and up until that point, they saw, when they looked at the stars, all of these tiny smudges on the images. They thought, are these distant stars? What are these? But his new telescope allowed them to finally realize, no, these aren't just more stars in our galaxy. They thought our galaxy was it 100 years ago. All of a sudden, he's saying, these are more galaxies, distant from us. We're now aware of something in the order of 100 trillion galaxies in our known universe is the current prediction. It's an incredible size. When I think of the heavens, the work of your hands, what is man that you are mindful of him? This reflection has even more power now from Psalm 8. But as he starts observing these distant galaxies, what he is aware of is that the light wave that he picks up is a red phase. Now, if you were to take pure light and you pass it through a prism, we've all done these experiments in high school science, it comes out in a rainbow of colors with shorter to longer wavelengths. The color with the longest wavelength is red because the light is being stretched out. And the fact that he is observing all of these different galaxies are bringing back this red wavelength is saying that everything is expanding out from where we are. The entire universe is getting bigger and bigger in every direction. It's another point of confirmation. And then ultimately with the discovery of cosmic background radiation in the 50s, this afterglow of the Big Bang, it led to a revolution in the scientific community where now there is a near consensus that our universe came into existence, space, time, matter, and energy at some finite point in the past, supposedly some 13.8 billion years ago. Our universe had a beginning. Now, what this has done is it's provided extra evidence for the second premise of a famous argument for God's existence. This dates all the way back to Al-Ghazali, a brilliant Islamic scholar in the Middle Ages. And Al-Ghazali framed the cosmological argument this way. He says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. It's relatively self-evident. If something comes into existence, it couldn't have caused itself. The chicken didn't cause its own existence, right? There was an egg, and before that, a chicken. We'll keep going there. The universe began to exist, premise 2. Now, this was something that philosophers already predicted. They said that it's impossible to have a past infinite series of moments. There had to be a moment, a first cause, a prime mover, but all of a sudden, scientifically, we have new evidence to support this, the origins of our universe, which leads to an inescapable conclusion. By good logic and sound reason, therefore, the universe has a cause. But if space, time, matter, and energy are the effect, what then is the cause? Well, it has to be spaceless, has to be timeless, has to be immaterial, and obviously enormously powerful to bring all that now is into being, which sounds a lot like the classical attributes for God. And so one argument for God's existence has been strengthened by scientific discoveries in the last 100 years. Let me give you another that I find even more persuasive. In Psalm 19:1, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands, right? That something about our creation speaks and it reveals the reality of God's existence. It testifies to his glory. I want you to hold that in your memory. Because the scientists have gone on to discover in the last few decades, about the last 4 decades, is that many of the fundamental building blocks of our universe, many of the forces, many of the constants and quantities, the numbers that are fed into the system at the very beginning, exist on a knife's edge of improbability in order to be able to allow for intelligent life anywhere in the vast reaches of our universe. Life should be impossible. But it's not. We're here. And the more that they observe these sorts of forces put together in a precisely fine-tuned way, the more there is this profound amazement, what scientists now refer to as the fine-tuning problem. Whether we're talking about the gravitational constant or the strong or weak nuclear forces or the cosmological constant, all of these could have been very different, stronger, weaker, more or less. And in any other iteration as we know it, and they've mapped this, my friend Luke Barnes does with this with computer models. He did his PhD on this subject at Cambridge. He teaches in Western Sydney. He said, if we change the values of these dozen or so fundamental qualities, then life would be impossible anywhere in the vast reaches of our universe. So what is the explanation? If there's so many different ways that it could have non-life and only one that it could have life, what is the chance that it just so happened accidentally or by pure luck that we happen to be here? Well, these sorts of calculations have been done. Let's just take one of these particular features, what's known as the strong nuclear force. This is the force that binds the various parts of an atom together. And we're told that the fine-tuning of this force to allow for life is, when it comes to the odds, 1 in 10 to the 37th power. That's 10 with 37 zeros after it. That's the bank account that I wish I had, right? As opposed to the mortgage which I currently have. That is an inordinately large number. In fact, it's really hard to wrap your head around the chance of just this one force being so finely tuned. And so to help you, Paul Davies, a North American astrophysicist, he offers this image. He said, let's say we take the entire continent of North America. Has anyone ever traveled to North America before? Canada, Mexico, the US. It is a huge continent. And let's say that you cover the entire continent of North America in small 10-cent coins. Right? Can we all just agree that that is an insanely large number of coins to cover the entire surface of the continent? It's still not enough. You would need to then stack up those coins all the way to the moon, some 200,000 kilometers away at its furthest elliptical point. All right? Can we all just agree that that is an insanely large number of coins? Let's pretend you won't have any problems with zero gravity, maybe you use special kind of glue, whatever. but you cover North America, stack it all the way up to the moon. You know what? That is still not enough. Paul Davies says you would have to take another 1 billion continents, the same size as North America, and repeat the process. Cover them in 10-cent pieces and then stack them all the way up to the moon. And then you would cover one more 10-cent piece in red paint, hide it somewhere in those 1 billion and one stacks, blindfold the poor person sitting next to you this morning, and send them out into the wilderness to, at random, just choose one coin. He said the odds of them choosing the red coin out of those 1 billion and one stacks is, roughly speaking, 1 in 10 to the 37th power, which is just the chance of that one fundamental force being so precisely calibrated in order to allow for intelligent life. Chance is just not a viable explanation for what we see. And when you multiply chance probability by chance probability for each one of these forces, the numbers get beyond calculation. There's not enough atoms in the universe to even speak of it. Which is why Sir Fred Hoyle, a British astrophysicist, a skeptic, a non-believer in God, the guy who coined the phrase the Big Bang, he didn't want there to be an origins of the universe, and yet 20 years later, observing this data of fine-tuning, he makes this profound admission. He says a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics as well as with chemistry and biology, such that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Just so you know, that is as close as you will ever hear an atheistic scientist come to quoting Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So whilst I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist myself, I just read and think and try and learn from these giants, I kind of go with Ard Louis on this one. It seems the more we study nature, the more we find these fingerprints of order, of design, which we infer upwards towards intelligence. That God is the best explanation for the origins and fine-tuning that we've discovered through the scientific endeavor. But let me close with another exploration. Can science ultimately explain everything? I mean, is science even the right tool to try and explain or discount belief in God? Because it seems to me that many of the things that we are rational and warranted to believe in are simply not accessible by science. Science is a wonderful tool. It's what's given us flight through in planes. It's what's given us medicine. It's what's given us the technology that I'm now magnifying my voice through or showing you screens. Science is a profound gift from God to be able to understand and harness nature towards human enterprise. But it cannot explain everything. In fact, there is a wonderful piece of philosophical theater. I really don't like gotcha moments in arguments or debates. So-and-so destroyed so-and-so. I'm really not in for that culture. I prefer meaningful discussions with people who disagree. But there is a wonderful piece of philosophical theater in a discussion between Peter Atkins, a famous chemist from Oxford, who's an out-and-out atheist, and William Lane Craig, a Christian philosopher. And they were picking up on this question, can science explain everything? Atkins says, absolutely. He believes that science can answer any question worth asking. And he challenges William Lane Craig, well, give me one thing that science can't explain. And the response is beautiful. It's almost like a deer caught in headlights. Because Bill goes on to explain, actually, there are a number of things which we are warranted to believe that cannot be accessible by science. He says logic and mathematics. The axioms of logic and how maths functions needs to be presupposed in order to go about doing science, so it cannot be proved inductively by the scientific method. He said metaphysical truths like the existence of minds other than our own, that right now you're not just a figment of my imagination. Granted, it would be a strange figment of my imagination and probably be on a beach somewhere in Hawaii if I could control what I imagine, but how do we know that the person sitting next to you isn't just a projection or part of the matrix and you are the only person with a conscious mind? Well, we all believe that, but we can't prove it scientifically because to use science would be to operate within the matrix or within the system. How do we know that the past wasn't just created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age? We can't. that these memories haven't just been implanted. We can't know that, but we don't live like that. We don't believe that that's true, yet we can't use science to speak to that. Ethical truths. What it makes right, right, and wrong, wrong. David Hume famously said, as a skeptic himself, a Scottish philosopher, science can describe what is. It tells us nothing about what ought to be. But ethical truths describe what ought to be, how we should act towards one another, our moral obligations, and what ultimately is good, which is not accessible by the scientific method. Aesthetics, the beautiful like the good, is not accessible by the scientific method. And ultimately, history itself. Science cannot tell you whether Donald Trump won the election in 2016. Now, I happened to be in California at the time, sitting in a pub with a friend that I've mentored for many years, watching this very unlikely event playing before all of our eyes and seeing everyone around me dumbfounded by the future that they were going to have to exist in. I got on a plane the next day, got to escape. But science cannot tell you whether Donald Trump won the election in 2016. Why? Because science depends upon repeatable observation and experiment. Anything that happens once is a singularity which is not open to the scientific method. You have different rules of inference and historical inquiry to explore whether that happened. And even more importantly, personal relationships. Science cannot tell you whether my wife loves me or what she's thinking. It can measure her pheromones when she's sitting next to me. It can observe her behaviors and the things she might do around me. But the deepest parts of who she is, her own mind, her thoughts, her desires, are not something which are accessible to the tools of science. As a personal being, as an agent, she has to reveal that to you by speaking. And I think at the heart of it, with so many of these high-profile atheists who are scientists and their concerns around religion, is in fact an entire misunderstanding about how God and science relate. They think God and science are competing explanations for reality, which is not true at all. It's an entire misnomer. And let me explain what I mean by this. Imagine afterwards we were to walk up the back there and you were to notice that the kettle is boiling. And you said to me, Dan, why is the kettle boiling? And I was to say to you, well, the kettle is boiling because electrical energy is passing from the socket through the cable down into the copper coil at the base of the kettle. And when the electrical energy hits the resistance in the copper and the coil, ultimately that transfers from electrical energy into heat energy, which then passes by way of induction up into the water molecules, causing them to agitate faster and faster until eventually they're able to break the surface tension of the water and be given off no longer in a liquid state, now a gaseous state known as steam, and that's why the kettle is boiling. You would look at me and think, you've lost your mind. Smart ass, or something like that. Why? Because I haven't answered your question. You asked me, why is it boiling? And I answered how it's boiling. I used a mechanistic or scientific explanation to answer a question around intention and agency. Science cannot answer why questions. It answers how questions. If you want to know who you are and why you're here, that is a question, like with my wife's feelings, that you have to ask your Creator. And so as much as science is a wonderful tool in the tool belt of human knowledge to unlock the secrets of how nature operates and to use that towards our ends, exactly as God commanded in Genesis 1, it cannot answer all of the deepest questions of life. That's why God speaks, not just in nature, general revelation, but in history and scripture and by his Spirit to answer life's deepest questions of who we are, why we're here, and what hope is there for the human heart. I want to close just with a quote from Einstein. Now, hear me very carefully here. Einstein himself was not a Christian. In fact, he didn't even believe in a personal God. He was a secular Jew. He spoke often around belief in Spinoza's God, or maybe a pantheistic concept where the laws of nature are expressions of the minds of God. He believed that there's something more than just the material, but he wasn't a convinced theist. And yet he made this profound observation when it came to Jesus of Nazareth. Now, at the time of this interview, it was popular amongst skeptical circles to argue that the Gospels are entirely invented, that it's legendary material. Maybe there was a kernel of some ragged preacher named Jesus, but that over the decades, these stories grew and grew like a fisherman's tale around the size of the fish he caught last weekend. It got more impressive with each retelling until finally the Gospels were penned late in the first century. But all of it is entirely unreliable, and Jesus of Nazareth is made up. Now, when he was interviewed, he's not a New Testament scholar, but his answer as a scientist, I think, is amazing. He said, as a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene, of Jesus. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates on every page. No myth is filled with such life. Jesus is too colossal for the pen of phrasemongers, however artful, so that no one can dismiss Christianity without a witty remark. What a profound statement from the lips of someone who doesn't even believe in Jesus, yet finds him enthralling, somewhat inescapable, this enigma. If you're new to Christianity, Jesus claims to be the invisible God made visible, and the one who comes to reveal to us exactly how God feels towards us, around who we were created to be, how far we've fallen short of God's intention, and to reveal to us the depth of God's love and his desire to breach our creation and to bridge that gap in order for us to have a relationship with God again. And so if you want to know who you are, why you're here, whether there's hope, and what it means to have a relationship with God, I know of no scientific reason why you can't take every word of Jesus seriously. And I know a ton of scientific reasons based on the reality of intelligence as the best explanation of the universe we inhabit, to take what the scripture claims more seriously. Now, what we're going to do this morning is actually have an opportunity for you to ask questions. And I don't want to keep that completely confined to this topic. I know science isn't exactly everyone's big problem. People have all kinds of questions around judgment, around whether people hear about Jesus or not, around suffering, why God doesn't make himself more obvious and his hiddenness, around the bad deeds and dark history that the church has done that's left an anti-human stain on many people's hearts. And so whatever your questions would be, we're going to have an opportunity for Q&A now. But what I want to do is actually just give you maybe a 1-minute break. Have a chat with the person next to you. Maybe say, man, what stood out to you from that? Was anything interesting, anything helpful? And to come up, if I could ask one question, what would that question be? And then we'll spend some time in Q&A to close out the service. Thanks very much. The other thing to recognize is there's always layers to the questions that we ask. That no matter how good my EQ, I don't have the ability that Jesus did, where it says, and Jesus knowing their hearts said. And so if I miss some layers to your question, please feel free. I'll stick around. Come and see me afterwards. Would love to be able to help work through some other dimensions of that question. No one ever likes asking the first question, so I always just jump straight to the second. Maybe chuck your hand up and we'll go. Yeah, what's your name?
Zach.
Hey, Zach.
Based on the argument that you said if the universe exists, something must have caused it. Is it right to ask, if God exists, what caused God?
Really appreciate that question, Zach. For those repeating the microphone, I'll repeat it. The question was, I made an argument before, the Kalam cosmological argument. If the universe requires a cause, does that mean that God too requires a cause? Now, this is a really common question that's asked, who made God? In response to that, I know my kids have asked me that. God, Dad, who made God? If you made us, and if God made us, then ultimately who made God? And so it's a very, very common question. It's actually the central argument that Richard Dawkins puts forward in his book, The God Delusion. That the God explanation is not a good explanation because it just kicks the responsibility down the road a little bit. All of a sudden now you need an explanation as to why God exists. And so I'm very happy to respond to that, Zach. We have a video on our YouTube channel. Actually, up the back, I've got these cards with a QR code you can scan. We'd love you to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Questioning Christianity, but a video called Who Made God with a longer answer. But let me parse this out a little bit. There is a problem if everything that exists requires an explanation, then at some point, you're going to have an infinite regress of explanations, right? Let's go back to the chicken and egg. Chicken, egg, chicken, egg, chicken, egg. How far back can you push that, right? At some point, there needs to be a first cause or a prime mover. Otherwise, this particular effect would never have come about. If the cause-effect chain stretches infinitely back, that means the present moment would never arrive, which is why philosophers, well before scientists, argue that our universe has to have a beginning. Because for the present moment to get here, there has to be a finite number of events in the past, right? There has to be a beginning point. And so dating right back to Aristotle, philosophers have spoken of the need for a prime mover or a first cause in that link of events. You might say if a series of dominoes, right? For this domino to fall over, there had to be some eternal or first hand that got all the other dominoes moving. And what the Christian story argues is that this is precisely who God is. The Kalam cosmological argument states that everything that begins to exist has a cause. That word begins is very important in the argument. Because if God is by definition eternal, then he never began to exist. God is, quite simply, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. There is nothing before God, there is nothing after God. And so the concept that philosophically we need a first cause or a prime mover or a necessary being on which all contingent reality rests, all of that is healthily answered by the Christian claim that God is eternal. He is the divine hand that set all of the dominoes in motion. And so it's an enormously fruitful idea philosophically. It matches up with the claims of the Bible and who God is as an eternal being. And it means you can make an argument like the Kalam cosmological argument, because unlike God, our universe began to exist and therefore requires a cause outside of itself. God himself is uncaused. And so to say who made God thinks God is made, but if he's unmade, the question doesn't actually make sense. Does that make sense? Cool. Appreciate that. Thanks, Zach. Any other questions? Yes, our good man.
Yeah, it's not as good a question as that. Yeah, but so if I'm understanding you correctly, because I really liked the way that you described that at some point our questions around who God is or the need for God lead us to characterize that God with certain attributes. That's what sets kind of monotheistic religions apart from the Greeks and the Romans, because it had, like, for something to cause something else, it has to be beyond, right? It has to be beyond the something else that is made. So if there's an explanation for time, if time has a beginning, then the cause for time has to be beyond time itself, and so on. So this idea of cause, because what I find when I engage people around this question in the gospel is that answer that you've just given, Zach, doesn't seem to. It feels like sometimes it feels like there's an opportunity for the seed of the logic of that thought to take root in the mind and the heart of the questioner, but I feel like for some reasons it doesn't always take root. And what I'm wondering is this idea in our own brains of cause, is that itself, like time and space, something which God is beyond? Like how do we, if that's how we are to think about this, how does the brain boggle? I mean, it goes beyond, we're talking into the, anyway.
Yeah, I think I'm maybe picking up part of your question. It's just around how far can we push explanations beyond our knowledge of the natural world? Because certainly Newtonian physics was very cause and effect. It still is with quantum physics as well, cause and effect. But what happens when you go beyond the point of the singularity and the Big Bang? Do all laws of causality break down? And this is actually a reasonably common objection by some secular thinkers to certain theistic arguments, is you're still relying on principles of causality that we experience as part of the created world. How do we know that those principles hold outside of the creation of our space-time? And I think it's a criticism that you can take on the chin a little bit. I think the best thing we do is use the tools that we have to make sense of anything. And for the most part, when it comes to the arguments that I was presenting today, they're largely accounted for in abductive reasoning, which is what is the best explanation for this phenomenon. So deductive reasoning is you make a couple of premises that follow suit to a logical conclusion, God exists, right? Abductive reasoning is what seems to be the best explanation of the phenomenon that we see. So abductive reasoning is what cold case detectives or what CSI would do all the time. They walk into a room, they examine a whole range of information and evidence, and then they try and say, what is the best theory or hypothesis to fit this particular data? What is the story that best explains all of the features in inside the room. Can I make sense of it as something that's self-caused inside the room? Or do I have to say, no, there's someone that's come from outside the room. There's actually a perpetrator that we need to track down, right? And so that's largely what they're trying to do. And I think with the tools that we have available to us, it seems like the most reasonable way is to think that the causality principle holds. I see no philosophical reason to think that it breaks down. Just because the laws of physics break down doesn't mean the laws of logic break down, right? And so logical or philosophical axioms or principles aren't dependent upon how the laws of science or our natural laws are ultimately functioning. So if God is eternal mind, then we would say the laws of logic are expressions of God's mind. They hold whether there's a space-time continuum or not.
Dan,
Don't know if that's
the
helpful.
word axiomatic there.
Yes.
That's actually foundational in exact science, though, because all of our mathematics falls apart if we don't have basic axioms which are true and hold. You can't prove them.
Yes, and this is
foundational.
This is a big discussion. Like, I'm not a philosopher of mathematics. So one of the guys I studied under, John Lennox at Oxford, is wonderful in this area. I would really recommend. He's a pure mathematician by trade, and so he's written the book on calculus that a lot of people still use at university today in different courses. And he would be able to help a lot more on this. But it's similar to questions of morality. It's similar to the questions of logic as well as mathematical axioms. Are human beings inventing these, or are we discovering them? Are they part of the universe and we're using our various faculties to discover what God has woven into creation? Or are we inventing them and they just happen to be helpful tools until we can discard them for some upgraded thing? And there's some that have just held. So axiomatical truths, that they're given that reason because they hold in every scenario. Yeah.
I've got one, Dean.
Yes.
Mine's a little different because I'm thinking about your experience. How often when you're dealing with an audience, not necessarily in a church but another place, are you going to meet someone who maybe is an atheist? How often are you going to get challenged? And my question along that line would be, if we think about the history of science and we take everything, say after Kuhn, which changes everything, right? Thomas Kuhn's work. So he's going to essentially told us to think about our scientific theory as contingent, as the product of human endeavour. It's not a given. It's not necessary in that sense. How much has the shift toward a postmodern way of thinking affected the sorts of challenges you get in a room from people that have got, say, genuine questions, or they just go, who cares? We know science can be debunked too in that sense. How has that affected things?
Well, I think it depends on the strength of the arguments that are brought forward. And we are profoundly motivated reasoners. And this comes back to the fact you've got Francis Crick, you've got Francis Collins, you've got Sir John Polkinghorne, you've got Stephen Hawking. These guys are coming at the same scientific data, and yet they draw different conclusions. The conclusions aren't driven primarily by the data. It's also driven by the story that they're looking towards, the thing that they've experienced in their background, what they want to be true about the world. And so human beings are profoundly motivated reasoners. And it's one of the realities in our own biases that we need to try and hold in check whenever we make arguments or ideas. Do these actually stand on their own 2 feet, or am I just saying they're really strong because they actually line up with what I want to be true? And so whenever you enter into, I speak in schools regularly. Often the most precocious young men tend to be secular thinkers, and often people who are neurodivergent naturally are a much more high percentage, haven't yet had religious experiences. They don't tend to have the same emotional connections with the idea of God or the Christian story. And so very, very profound thinkers, but often will challenge you on these sorts of points. University level, the same. And so I enjoy going back and forth on what do we actually infer from any one observation? How strong is any one argument? And what we've done today is look at just a couple on the origins and fine-tuning of the universe, a particular version of the cosmological and teleological arguments. There are 2 out of a broad range, about 24 arguments for God's existence, or families of arguments for God's existence. And it really is taking stock of the whole, what makes the most sense of all of these. It's why I prefer the abductive reasoning rather than letting everything rest on one argument in particular. But I think for most people, there's still a strong lean into the authority of science to tell us the truth. So rather than dismissing it all that much as being just a human product or a way of making sense of things, it still carries a lot of currency in people's minds, which is why I think as we present God, it needs to be one of the things in there. And what you'll notice about how I presented today is I'm showing the things which Christians of every stripe can agree with. So whether you're a young earth creationist and you think the universe is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, whether you're an old earth creationist, whether you're a theistic evolutionist, all Christians would unite around these key ways in which nature points towards God's existence. And so rather than becoming into competing silos of explanations as Christians, I think we should unite in our evangelistic efforts to present, no, nature absolutely points towards God. Exactly how that data fits in then with an interpretation of Genesis, that's where Christians will disagree. But we all agree on that there is a creator and that his will is made known not just in creation and what we can learn about him through nature, but also through scripture. So I think science is still an important piece in that puzzle. Yeah. It'll probably depend on which university you visit as well. Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, we probably need to pull up stumps just because other people are going to be coming into the building reasonably soon. I just thought I'd remind you that these cards are up the back. If you want to jump on, our YouTube has 100-something videos nowadays answering most of the big questions just in relatively shorthand, sort of 5 to 7 minutes. Please do check that out. That would be great. Don't forget to pick up one of these conference flyers for the Thinking Matters conference in a few weeks' time. Sean is a wonderful communicator, a good scholar and lecturer from over at Biola University. And there are copies as well up the back of a book that I've written with a friend of mine, Rian, called Questioning Christianity. And our real heartbeat in writing this was we've both been in pastoral ministry. We both did a lot with Red Frogs, evangelism and young adults and stuff. And we realized that there are great books out there that either tell what the Christian story is and what Christians believe, or that offer answers to many questions that people have, objections about Christianity, but very rarely are those put into the same place. And so most of our skeptical friends are a bit apprehensive towards religion, and we wanted to write a non-cringy book that's subversive and that you could put into their hands that retells the entire story from Genesis to Revelation in a way that answers life's deepest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? How do I make sense of what's going on in the world? That explains what it would mean to become a Christian in the modern world in the second section, and then the final and largest section, which answers 7 of the top doubts, objections, barriers to belief that we encounter everywhere that we go. So that's useful to you. It's great to give to people, but it's specifically useful as well for Christians to get better language to know how to talk about what they believe and to be able to respond to the questions that people are asking them. So you can pick that up as well. It's been a privilege. Thanks so much for coming and having a listen.